time is love. And that's an ingredient it's an ingredient in cooking, it's an ingredient in saunas, it's an ingredient in life, it's an ingredient in everything we do if we do it right.
Hey, welcome to Sauna Culture, the show all about the wellness practice, design, and culture of sauna, and the stories of people's lives being transformed by this practice all over the world. My name is Justin Jutton, and the host of the show. I'm here as always with Sarah Olson, our producer and co-host. Sarah, how are you today?
I'm doing great.
And today we have on the show one of the most highly respected people in my life, top echelon person. His name is Dr. Arne Vainio. Arne is a leader in the Anishinaabe and Native American community and Ojibwe community here in our area in northern Minnesota. And he comes today with just so much tradition and story and culture, as his family is both of Finnish heritage and of Native American heritage. Sarah, as you listen to this episode, as you heard these stories coming from Arne, what reflections, what are people getting ready to hear?
Yeah, I was just immediately captivated by his storytelling and how, sauna culture exists because of the people and the stories that they've lived and their ancestors have passed down. And we carry all of those things into sauna with us. And it just feels so amazing to celebrate Arne in this way. And every guest that we have, but this just feels really special.
Yeah, totally. And just fair warning, as a note around, as we get into stories like this, they are real stories. And Arne is not afraid to go into both the celebratory great moments as well as the difficult ones. So in this episode, we are going to tackle and be aware of moments of racism, moments of addiction, and moments of suicide. So for you, if that's triggering or if that's sensitive, we just want you to be aware of that on the front end, that we're going to get into that stuff. But if you're ready to go there, it is so worth it because it's such an honest look at life. And we think that when you look at the world honestly, there is difficulty. And how we get through that, how we heal, how we progress on is some of the joy of sauna, as well as some of the joy of living a good life. So here on today's episode, Dr. Arne Vainio, enjoy the conversation. Arne, thanks for being here with us. Thanks for joining us on the podcast. How are you today?
I am excellent, Justin.
You are freshly sauna'd, am I correct?
I am freshly sauna'd. So during the course of this conversation, I'll mention Steve Lepala probably
a lot,
multiple times. So Steve and I took a long sauna this morning. So we usually start about 8:30 and finish noonish.
Oh, love it. And, I think for me, you're a man who in my life holds a lot of tradition, a lot of ritual, a lot of culture. And here we are on Sauna Culture, talking all about, wellness benefits for sauna, history and tradition for sauna. And as we were going, I couldn't think of, many folks better prepared or suited just to have this sort of interview, to geek out, to hear about your story of it, and how fitting that we're interviewing on a day that the ritual of sauna with Steve continues, and you're glowing. You're glowing. Well done carrying on the tradition with Steve.
Absolutely.
So tell me a little bit, for folks who don't know you, I know you well, and just in terms of things that I see in your life that to me is, I respect a lot, is you're a leader in the Anishinaabe community here in the Duluth area. You're a medical doctor who serves those communities and have for decades. You and your wife are continually sort of caring about arts in our community. And then you also have this tradition with Steve as you're quite literally on a sauna quest, where you go touring and finding saunas that are special or sacred or meaningful. So to me, I feel like there's a lot of places to start. For folks who don't know you, I would love to maybe just start with kind of tell us the origin story of Arne Vainio. Tell us sort of where was home growing up, and what did culture look like as it related to sauna, and maybe all the cultures.
Anin in Denaway Maganadug. Dr. Vainio ni Indigenous Jaganashi Moing and Dashogamamades in the Ojibwe Moing. Missy Zaga Iganing Nin and Dunjaba. Migizi Nin and Dudame. A one equation, a caso nuo minuan in Moshe. Bejigo in Janus, Miskubene Sishan, a caso in Gozis. So that's Ojibwe, it's Anishinaabe. And Anin in Dinwe Maganadug. Anin and Buju are greetings. They're both hello, but Buju is kind of a casual greeting that we say to each other. Anin is one that we use that's more formal, that maybe you say to someone you really respect or someone you haven't seen for a long time. And Anin is the one I meant to use. And Dr. Vainio, Arne Vainio is my name in English. Ogamabinese is my Ojibwe name. It's what the spirits call me. Fond du Lac, or Mille Lacs is where I'm enrolled. Fond du Lac is where I work. I live in Duluth. Awanakwe, that's my Awanakwe Niwu. Ninimoshe is Ivy is my wife and sweetheart, and we have one son. And I grew up 100 miles north of Duluth, up around. I went to high school in Cook, and Bear River is where I went to elementary school from 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. Before that, I was in Alango, which is another small school close to that. But there was only 32 kids in the Bear River school when I was there, and I grew up taking saunas at my Finnish grandparents' place, and they had a sauna that they would light every Saturday. And community members, neighbors would come and take a sauna, and Wednesday night somebody else would have a sauna lit, and different nights. So there's always a sauna going somewhere. And Finnish people, my grandfather built a sauna first, and they lived in the sauna while they were building the house, and that's where they butchered animals. That's where babies were born. That's where people took baths, and it's a central part of life. And tradition is to build a sauna before you do anything.
Yeah.
And I grew up taking saunas. My first actual memory was my father. I took a sauna with my dad, and I was 4 years old, and it was hot in there, and it got really hot. And I remember my dad opening and closing the door. He had the screen door open, and then there was an outside door, and he was just opening and closing that to try to fan some cooler air into that room. And it was probably because of me, I'm sure that he took it pretty hot.
Yeah.
And I remember him carrying me back to my grandmother's house. There was just a path between the jack pine trees, and the cicadas were loud. They were buzzing, so it had to be summer. And my hair was wet, and he was carrying me, and I fell asleep before I got to the house. And it wasn't, probably a couple 100 feet to the house.
Yep. What a beautiful first memory, with this as a pretty big part of your life. One of those first formative memories is sauna with Dad. Mm-hmm. And I think you're right. I mean, so many of the themes that you just mentioned of sauna being very much a family space that everybody comes into. My little kids, are sauna goers, and they enjoy the sauna. They've been in it since they were babies. And also that it's a very communal space. You sort of brought up, hey, it was at Grandma and Grandpa's house. We'd go, we'd spend time. Other families would come. I love that sauna isn't just sort of the personal retreat space, the meditative space, although it can be for people. There's just such deep communal underpinnings with it, that it's the connected space for so many families, so many communities. What did that sort of up there, north of Duluth, North Shore, far up north, that's hard country to live in. That's hard country to get through long winters. And, was sauna a way that the family sort of, it was a balm on the cold winter day, as well as just the dirt and strife of getting through life?
Yeah, I think it was both of those things. The saunas, there are different. I've taken saunas at friends' places. A friend of mine has a sauna on a lake, which would be you step out of the sauna and it's running steps off the dock into a lake. And I haven't been in that sauna for a couple of decades probably. We kind of drifted apart, but that was a sauna that I threw a pan full of water on the stove, and he just freaked out. He said my dad would kill us if he knew we were throwing water on the stove, and that it's going to rust out the stove. And to me, that's the saunas and water. That's the steam, the spirit of the sauna.
Yeah.
Is that water, and saunas were practical. So, maybe meditative and all the things that we think about as saunas, but they were practical. That was a bathhouse, and we took baths. There was bars of soap and shampoo in the sauna and buckets of water, and we poured buckets of water on our head and washed up with the soap, and that's what everybody did. Nobody went in there and took a shower afterwards someplace. There was no shower.
Yep.
The sauna was the bathhouse, and it was meant to be that. My grandmother had in the changing room, in the first sauna. That one burned down, and saunas do that sometimes. And she had an ornate cast iron, a big kettle sort of thing with a stove underneath that built right into it. And that was the most beautiful thing. And when the sauna burned up, it just destroyed that thing. It was warped and it wasn't savable. And I've never seen another one. I keep looking on eBay for one of those things. And the closest I've come is a rendering kettle, but and maybe they used it for rendering and other things that I didn't see. But she used to use it for laundry. And then when we were taking saunas, there was hot water in there, even though there was hot water in the steam room itself.
Yep.
But I remember, and it was, a well that you pumped, by hand to haul buckets of water in, and that well water had a lot of iron in it, and I can remember the smell of that. I can remember the smell of my grandmother baking bread in the kitchen with an old cast iron cook stove, and and I've been looking for that bread ever since. Even in Finland, every Finfest there is anywhere, or Finnish festival, I've been to, and she didn't measure anything, and I remember that when she was making it, because she was always making it.
Yeah.
And it was just handfuls of salt and a handful of something else, and wouldn't measure anything, and was using galvanized pails to mix. I remember dough just coming out of one of those buckets. We went picking berries and we came back. Well, she had bread rising, and she had to stuff it back into that bucket because it was just going everywhere. It was like the blob. And but she made the most wonderful bread, and I didn't pay attention.
Yeah.
And been looking for that ever since. I think I found a bread recipe that I'm hoping is hers. I haven't tried it yet, but in a storage container when we were in Los Angeles. My aunt died and had a notebook with a recipe in there, and I'm hoping it's my grandmother's recipe.
Yeah. I have a similar experience with my grandmother, and she's still living, but years ago we said, Grandma, we need to know your Finnish rye bread recipe, because if you leave and we can never have this bread again, we're all, it is that staple bread for the family. Every time there's a gathering, it's there. Every time we're over, it's there. And so to me, when I think about sort of Finnish culture or many cultures, food is always essential. Food's such a key component to it. And then in Finnish culture, of course, also the sauna, the bathhouse, the space where you are doing that. It's fun that those things are so overlapped with you. That was sort of, was it dad's side of the family? The Vainio name?
Yes.
Is the Finnish side of the family. And I just hear so many sort of similar backgrounds to mine with that side of the family being immigrants, right? And needing to survive on the land, and the sauna being built first. Was there more of sort of that side of the family that you grew up with, other than just the sauna and grandmother's bread, of that immigrant experience up the shore?
When my grandfather came from Yala, Finland in 1903, and my grandmother came from Porti, Finland in 1908, I think. And she was a servant, a maid in New York City for a couple of years. And my grandfather put an ad in a paper that she read for a housekeeper up in Sturgeon, Minnesota. And she answered that ad, and they ended up getting married. And I think that's probably a thing that happened quite a bit. And
it was before the modern dating apps were a thing, I think.
Pretty much, yeah. And but as a wedding present, he bought her that cast iron cook stove, and he carried that. So it's 17 miles to Chisholm for where they were, and he carried that stove on his back in 4 trips.
Wow.
Those 17 miles on cow trails, and put it together, and that stove was going all the time.
Wow.
And when she died, my grandfather died when I was 14, and my grandmother died when I was 21. So she got to go to my high school graduation, and she was so proud. She was just so proud of that. And, at the time, there was no inkling from anybody that I'd be a physician someday.
Yeah.
And, but that cook stove was always going. And one of the other things that she had was the Singer's treadle sewing machine. So, and I remember her sewing on it when I was growing up. And when she died, when I was 21, I was not necessarily paying attention to things. I was, certainly hurt when she died, but I didn't ask family history questions. And I think that happens a lot, where when people start getting, really interested in their family history, that a lot of the people they want to ask about that or could ask about it are gone.
Yeah.
And, but we, I assumed we would inherit that property by the river, and then it wasn't like that at all. It got split up and auctioned off, and that cook stove was gone, and that sewing machine was gone. And I spent decades looking for a sewing machine like that, just to have it, just so I could remember my grandmother. And I looked at some, pretty decent sewing machines, but none of them were as perfect as I wanted them to be. And so I passed on them, and I didn't want an electric sewing machine. I wanted a treadle sewing machine. And I used to go to Los Angeles. My Aunt Bertie moved to California when she was 19, and lived there forever. She died when she was 94, and I used to go visit her every 3 to 6 months and spend time with her. And then she fell, and she was in a nursing home. So the last 5 years were, I'd pick her up from the nursing home, and we'd have to go to Costco, and I always tried to steer her away from that, because it was just too crowded, and the Costco in Los Angeles is busy. And, but she would never allow us to not go to Costco. And my Aunt Bertie had a electric sewing machine from the maybe 1950s, a Singer, that was in a cabinet sort of a thing. And it was mostly made out of plastic, and it was I suppose a nice machine, but it hadn't run in years. And every time I would go out to visit her, she'd just like, let's bring that sewing machine in, and we'll have it restored, we'll have it fixed. And she had macular degeneration. She couldn't see very well, and it wasn't practical. And every time I went out there, I would rent the smallest car I could find, because parking is at a premium in Los Angeles. And if you have a short car, you can park someplace.
Yep.
If you get a pickup, that you never park that thing.
Right.
And so there was never any room to haul that sewing machine someplace. And I always managed to make her forget that we were going to haul that in somewhere, because I didn't want to go, pick it up, and then it would never get used anyway. And when my aunt died, I brought my wife to Los Angeles, and we were cleaning out a storage unit, and my aunt had a neighbor, Cecilia, across the street from her, and Cecilia was an angel, and she was 92 years old, and used to go bring mail to my aunt and pick up things from the 99-cent store and whatever else for her. And it was the last trip out to Los Angeles, and I just wanted Ivy to meet Cecilia, and Cecilia to meet Ivy, and have tea together, and look at the ocean. And so we did, and we had a nice visit, and Cecilia was so happy to see me, and I used to hug her every time I saw her because she was so nice. And on the way out, she said, "Arnie, Bertie wanted me to save something for you." And I said, "What is it?" And she said she had an old sewing machine that she wanted you to have. And I was like, "I know that sewing machine." And I was thinking it was the one from the 1950s, the one that I had to keep, she wanted to restore. And I was like, "Put it on the street." And I don't want it. And she said, "Well, I think you should at least look at it." And I said, "Well, okay." So she came downstairs by the door, and I'd passed that so many times over the decades, and it was under a tablecloth, and she picked up the cloth, and it was my grandmother's treadle sewing machine, that original sewing machine.
The actual one.
The actual one.
After you had been searching for it for decades.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And that's when we mostly cleaned out the storage unit. And we didn't have room. We rented a car, a Toyota RAV4. I measured the inside of that thing. I went to a dealer and measured the inside to see if we could fit all this stuff in there, and there was no room. So Cecilia said she'd just keep it for another year, and then Ivy and I came back the next year. So that was like maybe, I don't think it was last year. It was the year before, I think. It was when the pandemic started. Yeah. And we flew out there a week before the pandemic hit, before they started closing things, and we drove back with that sewing machine. And when I got home, it was well used. It was rusty. It took me nights and nights and nights to take it apart and clean everything, and steel will rust off of things. And there was thread on there that was 50 years old. Yeah. And a bobbin. It was a 1906 Model 27 Singer sewing machine. It needed a belt, and it needed some parts in eBay and Etsy and all these places. Mm-hmm. You can find anything. Yep. And I found the parts for it, and used that 50-year-old thread. And the first thing I made was a mask for, everybody's making masks for COVID-19. And I made my wife a mask with dragonflies on it. And it was so cool. During the influenza pandemic, the 1918 influenza pandemic, masks were mandatory then. And people would have been making those masks. My grandmother would have been making those masks on that machine.
On that very machine.
Yeah.
Wow. 100 years later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it, that wasn't lost on me. And I was just sewing. Last week I started sewing again, and I bought a pinking shears, and I always thought that just made a fancy cut on things, but it makes it so it doesn't unravel on the sides. Okay. Didn't know that. And but I started making these little drawstring bags that are so simple. On YouTube, a good seamster or seamstress can make one of those things in about 10 minutes. That's not a 10-minute job for me.
So you're somebody who, continually has story to go with, memories to go with, culture to go with foods. What are some stories from the Ojibwe side of the family, the Anishinaabe side of the family?
So that's a lot of poverty. The boarding schools were designed to kill the Indian and save the man, in quotes, and they did a pretty good job of that. My grandfather was taken away from his family and put in boarding school when he was young. My Uncle George Earth was taken from his family and put in boarding school when he was young, and both of them are long gone. George Earth introduced my mother, my Ojibwe mother, to my dad. My dad owned the Good Luck Tavern in Sturgeon, Minnesota, and he treated George and George's mom and dad well, and had a bar, and George used to go and drink there, him and his mom and his dad. And that was a time when Ojibwe people were not welcome, and Finns were not necessarily welcome either. There used to be signs up in Virginia, I was told, that said no Finns, no Indians, no dogs. And George was always so proud that my dad would let them come in the bar and serve them like regular people. And my grandparents, my Finnish grandparents, would welcome George and his mom and dad into the house. And he's like, and that was just, it just floored him that they would be so giving. And then there were so George introduced my mom and my dad, and my mom didn't really like my dad at first, but they grew to love each other and got married. And George just, he loved my dad and he loved my mom. And George's mom, when I was 4 years old, right around there, George was working in the woods with his mom and dad, and they were lumberjacks, and lived in a small shack, and the shack got towed to wherever they were working, and they just lived in, no running water. The person they worked for would haul cream cans full of water for them, and they maybe had propane lights. I bet they didn't. I bet they had candles and kerosene lights, and George was, his mom was walking home on the gravel road back to the shack, and somebody ran over and killed her, and nobody investigated, nobody cared. And right about that time is when my father died by suicide, and that my dad's death happened when I was 4 years old, and that had to be the same summer that he was carrying me back from the sauna, on that, with the cicadas buzzing. At July 23rd is when he died by suicide, and so that would have been the height of summer, and I bet that sauna was, within a month before his death, and George left. There was nothing left for him. And he left for Minneapolis to go be an alcoholic for decades before he came back into my life. And Ivy saw him at a powwow. My wife saw him at a powwow, and he had George Earth on the back of a folding chair. And she said, "That's your relative. That's probably your relative." So I went to go see him and introduce myself. And that was probably 15 years ago, maybe. And he was in his full regalia at a powwow, and I said, "George, my name is Arne Vainio. And I started to try to tell him who I was, and he was just so happy to see me. He was like, "Arne, I've been looking for you all these years," and we were family again. Wow. And George and I took a long trip. We took a car trip out to. I was speaking as a physician at a cardiovascular conference on the Wind River Reservation, and they were going to fly me out there. I was telling George that they were going to fly me out there, and it's a reservation, so there's no direct flights, and there's no, the closest airport is 200 or 300 miles away. And I was telling George that the flight I was taking was out of Duluth to Minneapolis to Dallas, Fort Worth, and then back to Duluth. And it was so complicated. It was a 14-hour flight to get there. And then we had to drive. Somebody had to come and get me, and it was a 200-mile drive. So that would have been 4 more hours in the car. So it would have been 18 hours. And George said, why don't we go out there and why don't we drive out there? And it's like, George, I don't have enough time. I don't have, that would be 4 days of, driving there and back. And I don't have that kind of time. And he said, ask the clinic for time. So I did. And they said, sure. And George and I took a 4-day trip. And George had pulmonary fibrosis. So he had scarring in his lungs from years of working around mechanic stuff and brakes and clutches and asbestos and running chainsaws and he was dying from pulmonary fibrosis, and he knew he was dying, and and I knew he was short of breath, but I didn't know he was dying at that time. And he spent that entire 4 days just putting all these stories into me and telling me things that were important. And in the 1950s, there was a government program to relocate Native people into cities to try to assimilate them and get rid of reservations. And so they promised them good jobs. And there was, documentary films like in the beginning of a movie, and, telling about the great opportunities for Native people to move to the cities and get jobs as welders and teachers and whatever and all this training. And George fell for that. And so did my grandparents. My Ojibwe grandparents moved away and went to the cities. And my grandfather they both worked in the same place in the state sanitarium. And my grandfather had a menial job working in a kitchen, and he mostly made ice cream. And my grandmother worked in a laundry, and neither one of them ever got promotions, ever got, they might have gotten some raises if it was state law or something. But they used to have car payments all the time. They would get a brand new car, every 2 years and trade off their old one. And it was everything they could do to make that car payment. They came and took my brother Kelly and I back with them to the cities, and we spent part of a summer there, and it was miserable. Kelly and I would have to stay in the house. They said, don't you go out of the house. And they lived there was just a street outside the house and not much of a yard, and the neighbors weren't nice to us, and they weren't nice to my grandparents. And so we would just stay in this little apartment, and they didn't want us using a lot of electricity because it was expensive, so we didn't have the lights on during the day, and we just sit in this sweltering hot apartment with cockroaches running around. And but my grandparents would on weekends, not every weekend, but my grandfather would put on a white shirt and they would dress up and drive up north to show everybody how well they were doing when they really weren't doing that well. But it was important for them to think that way. And they were driving through a small town up north, and my grandfather bought a 1967 Chevrolet Impala 4-door, light green. And they were driving that up north on a Friday night to show off to everybody. And they got stopped in a small town on the way up. And they got put in jail because my grandfather they just couldn't believe that Ojibwe people could be driving a brand new car. And they spent the weekend in jail with the guards walking by and banging a tin cup on the bars and calling my grandfather chief and my grandmother a squaw. And they didn't make it up all the way to visit everybody. They had to head back to work. And when they let them out on Sunday morning and they found out that car was actually my grandfather's, they let him out, didn't apologize, nothing. And my grandfather actually said thank you on the way out because it was the only thing he could say. And that kind of stuff colors the way I grew up. My brother Kelly and I when we were staying with them, we went to a Ben Franklin store in the cities, and there was a toy aisle, and Kelly and I couldn't leave that toy aisle. It was like it was a dream come true. There was trucks and things that my grandparents couldn't afford, and small helicopters that you'd wind up, and all this magic. And Kelly and I got to the end of the aisle and looked over, and there was a counter, a lunch counter there with stools that had red vinyl and chrome and a Formica top, and there was all these people sitting there having lunch, and there was pictures of cheeseburgers on the menu above where the waitress was, and it was malts, a picture of a malt, and I probably only ever had one in my whole life.
Yeah.
And we wanted to have lunch there, and so we were sitting at that counter and spinning around in the stools, and my grandparents came up and they were like, "Please, can we have lunch here?" And they sat down, and he was like, they were both like, "No, let's go somewhere else." But we begged and begged and begged, and they sat down. And the waitress didn't even come up to take our order. She leaned back on the back counter with her arms crossed, and she just looked at us and just, kind of smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Mm. And all the other people stopped eating, and they just watched us. And finally, my grandfather said, "We'll go somewhere else." And we went to a bar on Hennepin Avenue someplace. And we walked in, and it was dark, and it was smoky. People were smoking cigarettes in there. And it was just a kind of a greasy smoke from the kitchen, and the walls were peeling wallpaper, and there was a Formica or a linoleum floor that had torn linoleum. And we sat in a booth, and the waitress came, and she was smoking a cigarette, and she took our orders, and I wanted a malt and a cheeseburger, and so did Kelly, and my grandparents said, "You're getting the special." So we got this hamburger steak and mashed potatoes with a little dipper of, or they dipped a hole in the mashed potatoes and put gravy in there, and peas and carrots. And I was sitting at the edge of the booth, and that hamburger steak was so tough, I was sawing on it with a butter knife, and the plate flipped over and landed on the floor. Mm. And the waitress came in, and she was mad at me, and she scraped all that stuff up and mopped the floor, and there's still bubbles kind of in that soap suds on the floor, and my grandparents didn't say anything. My brother Kelly didn't say anything, and they just ate. Nobody said a word, and the waitress didn't bring me any more food or anything, so I just sat there while they were eating. And we got out of when they finished eating, we got out of the bar, and my grandmother she leaned down, and she just kind of hissed at me and said, "We take you to a nice place, and you embarrassed us." And both my brother and I, all we wanted to do was get back home and not be in the cities. Mm. So, but there were good memories too. My grandparents used to take us fishing, and my grandfather we had a canoe, an aluminum canoe, and he tied that on the top of that Impala, and he couldn't afford canoe carriers, so we had old tires holding the canoe on the roof, and I was embarrassed to be riding in that car with tires holding the canoe down, and I slid down in the seat. My grandfather knew exactly why I slid down, that I didn't want anybody to see me, and he was mad at me. But we went out and fished and caught fish and brought those back home. And my mom had 7 kids. After my father's suicide, she remarried, but she remarried an alcoholic, and but there was 7 kids in that house, so we had to catch a lot of fish.
Yes. So a full house, a full sort of family of immigrant Finnish sauna takers on one side, Anishinaabe family on the other, feeling the weight of the oppression that was sort of evident all the time, every day. How did you sort of, among those 7 kids, decide to be a physician someday? That path of getting from, in that upbringing to kind of where you are now and how you've been serving communities.
Yeah, so I never knew that path was there. I used to read. So when I was 5 years old, one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish, I mean, just, I used to read. I would read anything and everything I could get. And then, I don't know when I started reading science fiction, but a friend in grade school, Randy and I, we would just we read everything, and we read science fiction, and we read Ray Bradbury and Isaac Asimov. And I remember one time a friend of mine came to pick me up, and it was a rainy day, and I was curled up on a chair with an old torn blanket, but I was reading, and he came into the house, and he's like, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Reading." And he thought that was so funny. And he said, "What are you reading about?" And I said, "Mars." and it was weird, I felt weird, but all the robot stories and Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury and, the Martian Chronicles, and I would read those things and know that there's a different world out there, even if it was a different world. And I never wanted a job in the mines with health insurance and retirement stuff, because I knew I would want to keep that and not go anywhere. And I had this travel thing inside of me that I actually hitchhiked all over the country when I was younger, and had some fairly dangerous things happen. I got picked up by somebody that was looking for drugs, and he didn't need any more drugs. He was already full of them, and but took me 40 miles out of my way, and I finally had to just jump out of a car when he was stopped at an intersection that he wasn't going to stop at, but there was another car coming, and I just jumped out. And but even that, I was probably 17 or 18 at the time, and it was just part of the game, I guess. And knew not to get into a situation like that again if I could help it. But the physician thing was never there. I worked in the woods, and I was ran skidders pulling trees out of the woods, and loved it. Loved running skidders. And then I worked construction and traveled around. We did piping for a lot of Army Corps of Engineer jobs. And the guy I worked for, I liked him a lot, and he liked me, and just put full trust in me. And I was the superintendent, and I didn't even wear shoes all the time, and but I understood machinery, and was and still am a very good heavy equipment operator, and I loved that.
There is an art form to running big machinery.
Yeah,
you got to know what you're doing.
Yep, and you have to have an eye for level and a bunch of other things that I have.
Mm-hmm.
And but I loved all of that. And I worked in a body shop and painted cars and painted equipment and did sandblasting stuff, and worked in a sawmill. Loved sawmills, still do. I was thinking about sawmills yesterday. And but none of those things really made a big difference. And then I took someone, my cousin's uncle was an older guy, and he was a good guy. We used to make homebrew. He used to make homebrew, but I'd be in on it. And we used to trap fish illegally, and just putting fish nets in the river. And there was two people with him, and he was feeding his pigs, and he went down, and it just fell down. And somebody had to run a quarter of a mile to call the volunteer ambulance service, and it took 45 minutes probably for them to get called in and to make it all the way from, 30 miles away from where they were. And he died. And the two people that were with him, all they could do was just watch him die. And I never wanted to be that person. I wanted to be able to do something. So I took an EMT course. There was just a small ad in the paper for an EMT course, and it was $35 or something. And it was a 110-hour course. And every Wednesday for weeks and weeks, you'd go and do this maybe 3 hours of learning about oxygen masks and bandaging and just basic life support stuff and CPR. And but it was the first time I was with a group of people that were just absolutely on fire for something. And every one of them was crazy for first responder stuff and ambulance things and it was, I loved it. I loved all that stuff. And then the course was done and we got our certificates and it was just done. And that was it. And I was working in a body shop, and there was a big long hill that the pulp trucks, the semis pulling 40-foot trailers full of logs, they'd go fast past the body shop so they could make a hill, and a pickup pulled out in front of those trucks, and I was sanding on a truck with a machine sander, loud, and I could feel that truck hit that pickup, and I ran out there, and there was a woman in that pickup that got hit, and there was logs all over the place, and those big truck tires were going flat, and they were just hissing, and she didn't even know she got hit, and the windshield was broken out of her truck, and she was just laying on the pickup seat, and all this glass in her, and her mouth was full of blood, and I just scraped that out with my fingers, and she was looking around, and she was bleeding, and I was holding her head still so she wouldn't move her neck, and the ambulance finally came, and that whole time I was with her, she was afraid, and I just stayed with her and kept her calm, and we got her onto a backboard into the ambulance. But as the ambulance crew was putting her into the ambulance, they had her on a stretcher, and they kind of leaned it over to the side to get it out of the truck, and then she saw all that destruction, and she saw me there, and she just whispered, "Thank you," and then I never saw her again. But from that led to me being a professional firefighter and paramedic for the city of Virginia, Minnesota. And I absolutely loved that. And I loved being in the back of the ambulance. And none of the physicians up at the hospital would really listen to me because we had all this advanced cardiac life support stuff, and I didn't have any chemistry, and I didn't know why there was, a negative sign after a chloride and a positive sign after sodium and two positive signs after calcium, but I knew, that they flux in and out of cells, and I could regurgitate this stuff that was in the ACLS manual, but nobody could explain to me, what those electrons were and all that sort of stuff, and I just wanted to know more. And my paramedic instructor and I, Mark Guyer, he's a anesthesiologist now, but we quit our jobs at the same time to go chasing rainbows and go to medical school. And he came from a medical family, or at least people that understood medicine. And, I came from a family where nobody had ever gone to college, and I didn't know what med school meant. And there's probably maybe a double handful of people that I think are responsible for guiding me into medical school. Some people did small things, and some people did huge things for me, with no, not necessarily any gain that, for them. And I always say, when I was a little kid after my dad died, one of the truck drivers came to the bar, and it was just a gravel parking lot with potholes in it, and mud puddles and all kinds of stuff. And, and I was probably 5 years old. And one of the truck drivers that was stopped at the bar smoking cigarettes and, half drunk, let me sit in his lap and drive that big truck across the parking lot. And that was it. I was hooked. That's all I ever wanted to do was drive a truck. And, and that's what I wanted. I wanted to be a truck driver. And, and I freely say that, less than a double handful of people messed that up, and I ended up in medical school.
And it turned out okay.
It did.
Yeah. But do you still get to drive a big truck every now and then? Not enough, maybe?
Not enough.
So, Arne, tell me a little bit about, to turn the corner maybe back towards sauna a moment. I think a lot of people actually now are discovering sauna not through culture, but through wellness benefits, through health. They're sort of seeing the scientific studies, the medical studies that have been really coming out a lot in the past handful of years that is sort of bringing sauna to new people in new places. And one thing I really care about is to make sure that, it isn't sort of this new wellness fad, because sauna has so much cultural history, that it isn't this appropriated version of sauna. And it's also kind of fun that, my grandma and grandpa have always said that sauna is this cure-all, whether it's true or not. Now these studies are coming back and proving that, look, it's good for our heart health to take saunas. It's a cardio exercise. How do you, as a physician, think about sauna in those terms? Because we've spoken a bit before, and that isn't the sort of first play you think about when you think about sauna. It isn't necessarily medical, but maybe talk about that for a little bit, being a physician and being somebody who has loved and grown up with sauna your whole life.
Yeah. Sauna is all of those things. It is, from a cardiovascular standpoint, it is healthy, and there is no clean you get like coming out of a sauna when you
absolutely,
and you can feel it. And getting back to my friend Steve Lepla, sauna is his pharmacy, and it's the best thing he's found. And the friendship that's part of that, it is family. Not everybody has the family they want, but you can have family by choice. And Steve and I do that. And Steve he's got chronic pain issues, and he's got sisu. So sisu is Finnish, and it's intestinal fortitude, and it's courage, and it's, if you look at Ukraine right now, and they're not Finnish, but, you see sisu, you see it in their president, you see it but I see it in Steve. And
it's grit and perseverance, but especially in the face of difficult odds.
Yeah.
It's the most poetic version of sisu I often refer to as the ability to make it through a long winter.
Yeah. And sauna does help all that stuff. And, for Steve and I to be taking saunas together, and we do this sauna quest, and it's healing for me in addition to Steve. And, I don't necessarily dwell on the bad things that happened to me when I was growing up, but, they're there, and it's part of who I am. And it's, it's part of any sisu that I have is from that. And Steve and I recognize that in each other, and that is different for both of us. But, but we know that when we're sitting together in his sauna or in a savu sauna in Finland or a floating sauna in Finland, we've been to some beautiful saunas. So our sauna quest, the Cedar and Stone sauna in Lake Superior, and but Steve and I have the sauna quest where, our goal is to take saunas in historically significant or unique or special saunas in whatever way. We've been to the Ely steam sauna that's been going since 1918 or 15 or something, a long time. And, to sit in there with somebody that was, I think he was 70 or 80 years old, a man that was in the steam room with us. And they have these kind of rubber buckets, black buckets that maybe 3 or 4 gallons of water that they give you at the desk when you come in, and you bring your own water in there. And that guy was telling us that he was 2 years old and he was in one of those buckets that in the Ely steam sauna. And, to take saunas with somebody, and take a sauna as a bath with people that understood, that whole culture was beautiful. Steve and I were in savu saunas in Finland, and
for those who don't know, the savu sauna is a smoke sauna.
Yeah, so there's no chimney. They light the fire inside, and the smoke just fills the room, and they fire it for maybe 6 hours and heat up this massive amount of rocks, and then they throw water on the rocks, and the steam drives the smoke out, and and you leave it for an hour like that, and by the time you go in there, there's no trace of smoke. The walls are black, and you have to wear sandals and sit on towels, or you'll be the bottoms of your feet will be black and your backside will be black. So, but to sit in there and take a sauna, and it's a different kind of heat. It's, just from all that stored energy and to take saunas with people in that have been, that understand that whole, that it's sacred, that even for Finnish people, Ojibwe people, we think of lots of things as sacred, and, being in the heat like that is sacred, but it is for Finnish people too, to understand that and to understand the history behind it. But, to take a sauna in a floating sauna that was closed, but someone from Helsinki sent a message ahead to Oulu where we were and said, you make sure these men get the sauna in that sauna. And they were doing a sauna. The sauna was hot, but it was for volunteers. So Steve and I took a sauna in a floating sauna, with all the volunteers that are there working the sauna. But, to understand, the sanctity of that, and there's health benefits. There's health benefits in there.
Mm-hmm.
And, the sauna high that you get and the endorphin release, and, it's all part of the experience. And, when that steam hits, and then sometimes it makes you kind of put your head down by your knees to take that first steam. But, when that happens, I remember my grandparents' sauna, and I remember the sound of it. And well water has a certain smell when it hits the rocks. And we took a sauna at Masaba Park that's been there forever, and they use lake water for the sauna there. But that's a place where my father and my grandfather would have taken saunas. And to know that same lake water, is to throw it on the rocks and to feel that steam, it's the same steam they felt. And there's healing in that.
Yeah, what a beautiful picture.
Yeah, I mean, it is beautiful, and to be able to do that. And for Ojibwe people, tobacco is sacred. Akoe Asema means firstly, tobacco. So when we do our ceremonies, tobacco is always part of that. So, we use tobacco. Asema is the name for that. And the kind that I use is apakozikan, which I make. And I haven't bought commercial tobacco in a decade. I make all mine. And it's a slow process. And I'll be harvesting that again after this. I'm going to go harvest that so I can make my asema. And it has to be made during a certain time of year. It has to be made after the last thunderstorm and before the frogs sing. And they're going to be singing pretty soon. So there's not much time to do that. And I make enough so I can give some to elders that can't do that can't get out in the woods and maybe can't see well enough, but they need that for ceremonies. And so I make enough to give to them. And it's important for me to do that. But so we use asema. We use cedar is one of the things that we use for ceremonies. And cedar, when you burn it and it crackles like that, it calls the spirits. And we use sweetgrass and sage. Sage purifies. So when you smudge with sage, the smudging ceremonies are things that happen often. And sometimes if somebody's having bad dreams or whatever, you smudge the house with sage and you hang cedar up on the walls to prevent some of that stuff. And sweetgrass is one of the other things we use for our ceremonies. But when we traveled to Finland, I always carried that tobacco that I make. I carried it with me, and I put some of that into the fires of the saunas that we took, and it was important for me to do that. When we went to Pori when we were in Finland, my wife and Steve and I took a bus, and the schedules are in Finnish, and we thought it was like a 3-hour bus trip, but we got on the wrong bus. It ended up where we wanted to, but it took like 4 extra hours to get there. And
took the scenic route.
Way scenic route. But we got to Pori, and I found a stone, just that's the size of my hand, a couple pounds maybe, and I picked it up from the ground from where my grandmother came from the city she came from, and I carried that stone back with me, and I have that, and that Steve and I we're scheming a savu sauna, and even a regular sauna, but that stone will be the heart of that whole thing. Mm-hmm. And it'll be getting hot, and it'll be giving off steam.
It feels to me like that is just such the opposite way that so much of kind of modern culture works, that is fast-paced and digitized, and it doesn't sort of look back well. It's always maybe looking forward. And I experience you as somebody who cares deeply both about your ancestors, the land, and the history of the land that you're on. What about sort of this tradition of sauna, something like that, like having a stone from the land that Grandma immigrated from? Why is that meaningful? I mean, sort of illustrate that at one more level, because I see its beauty. Why go through the trouble?
The trouble is worth it. And when I cook things, and I do all our cooking, so at home, I'm the cook. But I'm not a chef. My grandmother was a cook, and she cooked all the time. And when I cook, I think about my grandmother. I cook a lot of the things in a cast iron Dutch oven that my mother had, and I cook in that same thing. And when I cook, I think about my mom. And when I cook, I think about my grandmother. Last night, when we were in Finland, when Steve and Ivy and I went to Finland, we had salmon every single day. Mm. And I think Ivy had salmon stew, lohi kieto, every day when we were there. And I made that last night, and I brought some to Steve this morning, so he just had that for lunch. And but when I cook things, my grandmother would have stuff on that, even in July, hot day in July, that cook stove would be going, and she'd be cooking something. And but she would make a beef stew sort of a thing, lihu moyaka. And moyaka, I think, it's a soup stew sort of thing that they don't say in Finland so much. That's an American Finnish thing. But the key to being a cook, I think, is time. And I don't throw things together. I rarely when I make something, when I'm serious about making something that people are going to remember, I cook it for 8 hours. When I'm cooking, that kind of moyaka, I use rutabagas and potatoes and carrots and onions and, maybe some celery, but I use soup bones and I use thyme. And I cook those soup bones, I'll cook them for 8 hours, 9 hours. And, when I have a friend I haven't seen her for a while, but she used to be my sister's neighbor, and people cook fast, and she took one bite of that moyaka that I made, and she closed her eyes and she put her fists on the table, and I could tell that she'd never had anything like that before.
Wow.
And it's time, and it's what my grandmother used. And time is love, and that's an ingredient in. It's an ingredient in cooking. It's an ingredient in saunas. It's an ingredient in life. It's an ingredient in everything we do if we do it right. When I do a ceremony every morning, and I put tobacco out. I put a sema out, and I put it on clean ground. But I thank the directions. I thank the spirits in the water. I thank our mother, our grandmother, the earth, and our grandfather, the sky. And I put tobacco out for people who are hurting and who have cancer and who just have difficult times in their lives. And I put that out by name for people, and that list is getting longer. And it takes me longer and longer to do that. But if I don't do it, I don't know who will. And when I put tobacco out, it's not a Finnish thing. That's an Anishinaabe thing. But I don't separate myself so much into those. I'm both of those things, and I can be both of them at the same time.
Yes.
And when I put, my father died by suicide, and Ojibwe gagiji means to appease to. It means to apologize to. Gagi Zitagazi means forgiveness. And I was at a ceremony, a washing away the tears ceremony, after my mom died, and it's a ceremony where veterans actually wash the grief from you with the community there. And I was outside the fire, and it was the night the frogs started singing. That was quite a few years ago. And but the frogs were singing for the first time that night, and it was deafening. They were so loud, and the sparks from the fire outside the ceremony were going up into the sky, and it was a starry night, and the sparks would go up there and like almost become part of that starry sky, and the smoke would go up and was going up, and I put tobacco into the fire, and I forgave my father and asked for his forgiveness. And when I put tobacco out in the mornings, when I put that out, that takes away just a little bit of my grief. Not all of it, and it will never be all gone. But part of that is gone, and part of that is forgiveness. And I asked my father for forgiveness for whatever at the same time. In Ojibwe culture, if you do things traditionally, and if you do things right, you can heal generations yet to come. but you can heal generations that have already passed. And when I heard that the first time, I thought, how crazy is that? How can you heal somebody that's gone? You know, how is that even possible? But it is. You know, I forgive my father every single morning when I put tobacco out. Part of that ceremony is in Finnish. And I say, Kiitos paljon, Isä, Arne Vainio. Minä rakastan sinua. Thank you very much, my father, Arne Vainio. I love you.
Arne, that is so beautiful, and thank you for giving us your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you for spending it and telling your stories, and helping them live on. I mean, I think your ancestors and those came before you are honored by you being who you are and by carrying out that. And what a joy to get to spend it with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, my grandfather often told this story of him in the sauna as a young boy. He would say that he lived on a farm, a little dairy farm, just 20 miles south from here, and he would, at the end of the long sort of work day, there would be the sauna heated, and he would always want to go in. He remembers being a little boy, and he'd want to go in when the men were in the sauna at the end of the day, because that is where the stories were told. And I experienced that in you. You're somebody who is full with beautiful stories, and thanks again for sharing them with us. We're honored, and I think folks who are listening along are honored. And I can't wait till the time where we get to sauna again.
Me too. So I would urge everybody. So Minä rakastan sinua does mean I love you, and in Finnish, and those are hard words to say sometimes in English.
Yeah,
they're hard to say in Ojibwe. Gazaga-in is I love you in Ojibwe, but if you say those words and you mean it, people will hear it. And sometimes it's, if it's coming from, the stereotypical angry Finnish old man. That was my grandfather. And, I can't imagine ever saying that to him or hearing him say that back. But, you can break through that in people and, learn to say it. It will change your life.
That's the spot to end right there. Thank you so much, Arne. Until next time.
Thanks, Justin.
And there it is. Amazing storytelling from Dr. Arne Vainio. Sarah, as you heard that, what are those things that are sort of just striking you after that episode?
Yeah, I just loved seeing the connection already between this conversation and our conversation in our first episode with Katya, of just the power of sisu and perseverance, and bringing those tough experiences, those tough life moments into the sauna, into moments of joy, and just powering through that, and also sitting in presence in the midst of that. So just really beautiful.
Totally. If you are needing a little bit of perseverance right now, if you are needing that grit, that sisu, as it might be termed in the Finnish language and the Finnish culture, we would love to keep providing some inspiration for that. So subscribe, share with somebody that you've found, that could value this conversation. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe, hit the follow button, wherever you're finding this. And we couldn't be more excited to keep sharing these stories with you from Sauna Culture. Thank you again, you guys. We'll see you on the next one.